Hey, it's Alex Williams of the New Stack. I'm here with John Daniel Trask, the founder of Raygun. Hey, John. Hey, you go by JD, right?
That's right, I do, Alex. Yep.
Great. Well, we're going to spend a little time getting to know Raygun a little bit, getting a little bit to know you, getting about your philosophy behind air monitoring, and we'll even do a little live demo of this APM service that you just are launching. Tell us about yourself. How did Raygun start? You're the CEO of it now, but what was that story back in the day?
Yeah, cool. Firstly, thanks for having me on. Yeah, our story is kind of varied. We started, a buddy and I started a company building software development tools actually back in 2007. We also built a bunch of other companies around, helping Kiwis give money to each other here in New Zealand. That's where my accent's from. And we did a whole lot of different endeavors. And then in 2013, we launched Raygun as a software crash reporting service. And that was because we were kind of scratching our own itch and we wanted something better for that. Because we kind of realized, there's a lot of dodgy software out there. Ours was included at the time, and we wanted to understand better how to make it so our software was, basically bulletproof and reliable. And so we built that, we put it out there, and turns out a lot of other people share an interest in building great software. And so it kind of took off from there.
Well, there's a lot of great software these days, isn't there? It's amazing how the quality has increased, isn't it?
I think it's really fascinating. I sort of think of it a little bit as the wave that came around with, Google, really, the idea that you wouldn't go to Google and get a 500 error page, and I think some of those bigger companies really started to set a bar that was really high and it started to become somewhat unacceptable. I mean, I can kind of understand why software was particularly bad, say in the 90s, and that we were moving so quickly that we kind of often let things slip by. And obviously the technology improved for reporting on issues, and being able to improve software with telemetry and whatnot. So it's been great seeing that quality bar increase. But at the same time, I can tell you as a person who's processing, a billion errors or so a day, there's
Yeah,
still a lot of dodgy software
a
too.
billion errors a day. So, is it? Tell me about the error load that you've seen change over the past 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, so the company's been growing in terms of getting more customers, larger customers. You probably are using services several times a day. They're actually relying on Raygun. And so it's capturing that software error data up front, and sending it through. We have seen situations where, for example, JavaScript generates a lot of errors. However, as you'll be well aware, sometimes they're quite benign errors. They don't actually necessarily impact the the user of a website, but some of them stop people from being able to check out on an e-commerce experience, and that's obviously very costly. So a lot of the work we're doing is to try and help people understand the nature of what's going wrong. And also, especially for larger organizations, it can be kind of intimidating at the sheer volume of issues. And so helping teams sort of develop their software development practices to prioritize in the right areas is another area. So we kind of say, hey, yeah, while we're processing a lot of data, and that sounds really cool, the bit of that's really of impact is how do we help these organizations then very quickly move through those issues and fix them quickly.
And so, you have watched the evolution of what we know as like these composed applications, right? And now we're starting to see microservices change. Perhaps you could tell us just first of all, what was the company originally set up to do? Was it set up to like to think about composed applications and how you do error monitoring with those composed applications? And how is your philosophy changing now as you're starting to see the the adoption of microservices?
It's a good question. It's kind of interesting. The philosophy that we actually took is that we started at the application level. And by that, I mean, when you create a Raygun trial, one of the first questions is, create an app, which is a little confusing, really, because we don't really care about the boundaries in there. We think about it in logical terms, not physical terms, typically. you can still break it up on physical terms. So in a microservices architecture, for example, you may very well want to create multiple apps in Raygun for each moving part in the background, or you may want to create an aggregate application that actually encapsulates all of those different moving parts into a single story. So we've kind of left the door open to however customers want to set it up. The thing that I think stood out when we started that way, though, was that at the time, I guess during the life cycle of the company, we've seen this rise of, the term DevOps, and it's a pretty loaded term. But I think historically, a lot of the tooling that was out there has often been very much focused on the ops folks. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it usually means that things are structured much more around, a service level, hardware configuration, stuff like that. While at the application level, you're sort of saying, well, we don't really care about whether it's running on 1,000 servers or whether it's running on one server. It's one application. So that's something we've sort of always been quite proud of, because it actually catches people off a little bit, kind of going, oh wait, so I could have 1,000 servers but be paying for a single app. That's quite cool. The next thing, though, is collecting all of the data and making sure that we don't then abstract away some of that detail. So, we've had customers who move on to Raygun and have, say, an application that spans 10 servers in a cluster. But because we collect all the data and can give you this sort of collective rundown of the aggregate information, you realize actually one of the servers in my cluster is totally stuffed. That's where all the errors are coming from. So you've got to kind of do a fair bit of work to provide the best of both worlds to folks. What I would sort of add to that, though, is that because of that model, we personally, we haven't had a whole lot of challenges with supporting a microservice architecture in there. And we also, just as some further background around the company, we started off with crash reporting. Then we built real user monitoring, which is tracking that customer performance. And obviously today we're announcing full APM on the server side. Now, those different products have different sort of parameters for how they support different architectures. So like in real user monitoring, you don't actually have to do anything on the back end. It's always the piece that connects with the user, be it the mobile user interface, JavaScript on your website. We don't really care about the services. And then APM, of course, is very much concerned with what's the physical architecture, servers, pieces, and distributed tracing and things like that. And that gets a lot more difficult.
That gets in more deeper into your architecture, doesn't it? Maybe perhaps before we go into this demo, you could tell us a little bit about that architecture.
About our architecture?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the way that that Raygun actually hangs together as a product is we're hosted with Amazon Web Services. And we've got we're predominantly written in C# on the Microsoft.NET framework, and we're moving slowly to the Microsoft.NET Core stuff, primarily because of the performance improvements that we've seen in there. We actually have a case study up on the I think it's customers.microsoft.com about the performance improvements we've seen there. And so we have auto-scaling groups that are dealing with the inbound API data, right? And so that kind of moves around throughout the day. We then queue all of that data up, and then we have these worker processes that are processing the different types of data, whether it's crash, RUM, or APM data now. And that has some scalability to it as well. And then we have different data stores on the back end that help us with the types of data. So we haven't kind of gone with the approach of one database is going to solve all of the different types of information. So we have a time series database. We've got Elasticsearch in the mix for search. We've got Postgres in there for our relational data. We even have maybe this is the classic engineers, inventing everything themselves, but we built our own storage engine as well to capture the raw data. So one of the things that's fairly common in our industry around these tools that are collecting data for people is it's expensive to store data. And so they actually drop a lot of data very aggressively. We don't tend to do that. We collect everything, we store it. You can go through and see the raw data that you sent through, which is always really compelling, I find, to engineers. They always want to know how things are working. And because in our system, as I'll show you later, frequently you'll see the beautiful interface and the things going on, but you can always go and say, okay, well, what was the JSON blob that triggered this to actually occur? And folks like that. So that's kind of a very high level architecture of what's going on in there. we don't silo the products in that they share their data stores. So, for example, that allows us to correlate and say, oh, you had the software error. Well, here was the user's journey from RUM that was in there, and here was maybe the APM server trace that led to the error. So we want to help you understand exactly what led to a problem. And as far as I'm aware, no one in the market is actually tightly correlating all three of those pieces of data together into a cohesive story.
It makes me think that there's a lot of stories here about tracing that we could discuss with you guys. There's lots of new thinking, I think, about all those components and how you think about all those, how you think about those components. But perhaps maybe, first of all, we could just take a look at this new product you're launching today.
All right, cool. I'll set up my screen share here. Go your screen, and I am looking for. Actually, before I do it, I'll just move your video to another monitor so we're not just screen sharing back on ourselves. All right. So let me know when that's coming through for you.
We got it. Yeah, there it is.
Cool. So keep in mind, we're going out today with the beta, so there's every opportunity here that things could go wrong while I'm clicking around. I will jump back to here to start with. So you don't mind, I'll talk a little bit to what we're looking at here. So firstly, you'll see up here, this is tracking a website called Mindscape. And so that we call this our application switcher. And this is to what I was talking about earlier, this idea that we want you to be thinking in terms of your applications and not necessarily so much about your physical infrastructure. And so in here, you can see I've got these different apps, including tracking my own blog. And then in the sidebar here, we've kind of got the products that are integrated with this application. So you can see we've got crash reporting, real user monitoring, and now we have APM. That's the new piece today. And I think a lot of your audience are probably fairly familiar with what APM is about. Tracking the performance of your application. It's typically focused on the server side. What's the app actually doing? And so you can see in here, this is the overview tab in here. We're looking at an app deck score, what is our requests looking like, so how much time is going into database queries versus the code versus API calls. You can see slow requests, all sorts of data. I don't want to run through every little piece in here. And this is also powered by our custom dashboarding tool. So if you click on edit this, we can actually go through and we can add different tiles that we'd like. We can also resize these things.
Very nice.
Throw them away, change the names, do whatever we want. And so that's something that's been really cool. For the last year or so, we've had this custom ability to build these dashboards, which people seem to love. So that's the overview level. But one thing that we're doing that's quite different, and folks hopefully notice that it's different to a lot of the classic APM tools, is what we talk about as being issues. And so issues, so on that, issues is about, today we see folks that put in APM products and then they will kind of go, hey, somebody said something was broken or it got slow. And so they then go and start looking at charts and they're looking at things and they're trying to tease out what the hell happened. What was the issue? Mm-hmm. And so with Raygun APM, what we said was, why don't we build out some rule sets that automatically are going to create issues for you so that you can understand and assign them to team members and also then track the progress on improving these performance issues. So it makes it much, much more action orientated rather than trying to read the tea leaves of some charts. Why don't we just tell you, hey, this page or this method is really bad. And some of the rules that we've got in here, I'll just open this in a new tab. You can see in here, there's standard ones like if there's a particularly slow trace. The ones I like is automatic detection of N+1 queries. Noticing that if you're calling a third-party API a whole lot, stuff like that, that would typically be a performance smell when you're trying to improve the quality of your software. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty cool and a bit different. But yeah, I'll just jump through here. And through these other tabs, you can go through and look for things and hunt them. We've got our standard filtering. But the traces to me is, this one here. The trace is really where the rubber hits the road.
Right.
So in this view here, you can see it's nice and colorful, much nicer for the audience to be looking at. And so this has captured this trace of a web request here on a demo site. You can see here we're overlaying our error data as well. So if there were errors, we could click straight through to the Raygun crash report about it. And you can see here that we've got all the methods that we're firing. You can see that this is a third-party API call to Xero, an accounting system. You can track over here and see the database queries that are firing. Now, this already is starting to look like we've got an N+1 in there. We shouldn't see so many queries to the user table over and over again. And on the side, we've kind of got this summary saying, you know what, there were 55 database queries triggered on this. One external API call, my code, and you can also see the time in there. It might be a little hard for people on the screen share. And then what you can also do is click on these things. I haven't hooked it up to GitHub at the moment. I'll see if I can. I'll leave it alone. But it will bring in the source code so that you can actually see the source code for the methods that you're clicking on to see. Oh, okay, that's what was happening in here. That might be why it's really slow. That sort of thing.
Okay.
That's pretty powerful stuff for connecting all of the parts of your development environment. So your source code, your server side, your errors, your customer experience, all in one place.
Neat. So why did you guys, what were you guys starting to see that you were thinking about that brings tracing to the front of, of your story in many respects? I mean, error monitoring is really your core, but tracing is becoming a much more critical issue we hear about.
Yeah, so what I think we're seeing in the industry as a whole is there's a lot of great tools out there in very specific niches.
Right.
So there are some APM tools that are good, there's some crash reporting tools that are good, there's some RUM tools that are good, and never shall these things meet. And the problem is that to really understand the health of your software, you cannot look at these things in isolation. You actually need to see them all together. And the last thing you want to be doing is kind of going, hey, well, I've got my crash reporting in one system and my APM open. And, I go in and meet with companies all the time. And that's often what's happening. They're trying to correlate between these things. And so what I think we're seeing in the industry as a whole is, firstly, it was very fragmented. Now we're starting to see some roll-ups occurring. There's acquisitions occurring all the time as people are trying to build out these platforms.
Right.
And some folks are doing it, like I say, through acquisition. We've kind of taken the road less traveled and said, why don't we just try and build the most integrated platform from the ground up that does share the data intrinsically between all the parts of it to give you the full view in one place. And the team ourselves, we've been finding this really, really valuable. In fact, we probably would have shipped APM a little bit earlier if it wasn't for the fact that when we were tracking our own software, the team got too excited about fixing some of the issues we were able to find ourselves. So I think where we're heading is that these days, I think crash reporting is starting to become quite a well-known commodity and an expectation within a professional team. APM obviously is a more mature market. People kind of expect some sort of tracing. Real user monitoring, it's been used for a long time by large corporates, and I think smaller businesses are starting to sort of clue on to the idea that if the users are having a bad experience, that might be affecting their business. And so bringing that together, I think, has been really important.
So you guys talk a lot about, the health, right? You were just earlier talking about the health of the applications, and and so what is that philosophy that you're bringing into this product that relates more kind of like a health matter? Because, I look at other peers and how they compare themselves. They don't talk about health as much. They're talking about like finding those exceptions maybe, and finding, these issues that, to help you kind of like respond to errors quickly. But what's the difference between that and looking at it from a health perspective?
Well, I think we talk about it from a health perspective because we don't. I think when you focus on things like just saying, "Oh, I know that I had an error," it's almost devaluing the point of things here. This is a solution for business teams, for technology companies, and more companies are relying on software. They are their whole business. I mean, and so I think kind of just focusing down on, hey, well, an engineer can do X quickly, doesn't communicate the real power of these tools.
Mm-hmm.
It still does that,
Mm-hmm.
but you need to be, what we're finding more and more, we're selling to product managers. We know of companies where they take their Raygun reports and they go in the board papers to the board of directors, because if the whole company is predicated on their software investment and that thing is getting worse or better, they need to know. Because that can, there are businesses that literally are dying because of poor software.
Yeah.
So I guess that's the kind of driver behind thinking about it more holistically as the health. The other thing that we drive through our platform as well is the idea of understanding impacted customers. And this is a little bit taken from folks like Amazon. When there's an issue there and they do a root cause analysis, part of it is how many customers were impacted. So Raygun will actually collect that as well, because I think us as software engineers, I love writing code. Right? I love sitting there writing code. When I'm writing code, I'm really focused on, the aesthetics of the code and my architecture. Why do we write code? We write code for other human beings.
Right on.
And we forget that sometimes. And
Right
we get
on.
really focused on the minutia and forget about the people. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a long-winded story. You might not have expected such a long answer on that, but that's kind of our conviction, is we think that the whole team should be using these tools, different parts for different people. So, I mean, I'll just screen share again here for you. And we'll try to move that thing. I think it might be this tab here. Yeah, so I mentioned the custom dashboards earlier, right? And so this is something that is becoming really, really popular with our customers, is that I touched on this with the overview within APM, but here, there's a TV mode on here. If we edit this dashboard, we add tiles, you can see how many different things you can put in here. So I want to understand, what's my percentage of crash-free users? What's the user satisfaction based on load time? How many people are using my software? And you can build multiple dashboards. They're all live, so data is updating constantly. And then you can also go through and configure these things, so you can even bring in data from multiple applications. So going back to your point earlier about microservices, I may want to partition them into separate applications in Raygun, but then pull them all together into one unified dashboard, that sort of thing. And so what we're finding more and more is companies are starting to put together these dashboards and put them on TVs around their office, not necessarily within engineering, right? You might have a support team where you want to show that there's been a spike in the error rate. So, hey, people are starting to contact us saying they're having problems, and the team can kind of eyeball it on the wall and be like, you know what, this isn't just because grandma's ringing up and doesn't know how to use the software. We're clearly suffering some sort of issue right now, that sort of thing. So I think, software quality is a company-wide issue rather than just the developer issue.
That's a story that we see emerging, is this software as a company-wide issue, not as an IT issue, not even as a product issue. And
Yep.
the board of directors really, dictates that. And they might be using terms like digital transformation, which a developer would probably just, look at and say, what are you talking about? But
Yep.
that filters down into more DevOps type style approaches, which we see in these tools that you guys are developing, but also in the practices of the companies that are using these tools. So it almost has like this kind of like cyclical effect on each other. So the DevOps is affecting new continuous development. The continuous development practices are affecting how we think about DevOps practices. It seems like that, these types of environments are going to be critical as kind of that, as the larger market matures.
I totally agree, and we've sort of seen that ourselves in our own growth. We look at what are people migrating from, right? And typically, especially when we started with crash reporting years ago, the answer was normally we're moving from nothing, or we're moving from something we kind of cobbled together in-house. A common one was, hey, I just wired up the exception handler to send me an email, that sort of thing, which doesn't have team capabilities, reporting, grouping, all that good stuff. And you're just starting to see, I think, back to what you started this interview with, there's this expectation now around the quality of the software that we're building.
Yeah.
And let's be honest, software
Yeah.
engineers, we're expensive people to employ. Who you don't want to go and spend millions and millions and millions of dollars on building software only to then be like, nickel and dime it right at the end and not actually care about the output. That's pretty pointless.
Well, there are so many endless endpoints now. The fabric seems to stretch on forever. It is infinite, and these error crashes are only going to increase. How are you preparing for the coming real onslaught of these major, changes in how we kind of are collecting data from any physical thing possible?
And just in terms of scaling,
Yeah.
yeah, it's an interesting challenge. I guess with apologies occasionally to our customers, what we typically do is we invest heavily in scaling, making things really fast, right? And we improve this stuff. And then what inevitably happens is that over the course of about 6 months or so, you're seeing a doubling, tripling, quadrupling of data volumes.
Yeah.
And something that was blazingly fast and you were happy with, suddenly is starting to get a bit shaky, and you're back in there, improving the performance.
Right.
And one of the things that we've sort of done is that while we do spend a lot of time, and an example of this is, we spend a lot of time talking about security practices. I think for a long time now, people have understood that we need to be more mindful of security, and so we're baking those concepts into, team training, whether that's external or internal, that sort of thing. We're actually finding that we're having to also bake in the performance mindset. Everybody loves to roll out the, performance optimization, too early is the root of all evil and whatnot. In our business, it's kind of like, no, we're always on the treadmill. We're always having to accelerate and try and deal with more data coming through.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a challenge. And that's actually, it's expounded by the impact actually of microservices, because what we're seeing with some customers is that one service goes down and so many things are talking to it. It's not like you generate an error. That can be often the critical piece of infrastructure that suddenly every single request has an error, and that can become huge volumes of data. And so we've really focused on that performance in particular right up front, at the API level, how we then deal with queuing, how fast we can then process it, how we can horizontally scale that processing pipeline. Are our data stores horizontally scalable? All of that sort of stuff.
That leads to so many other questions I could ask. But JD, I want to finish our discussion right here because I think it's a perfect place to end, talking about the future of these endless horizon of increasing amount of data. But that seems that is just your game, and the game you've been in for a while. So it sounds like it's just part of it for you guys. But we're going to be watching this space on how we do monitor, how errors are monitored and how you think about them in the context of larger, frames of reference, such as, distributing across, any number of nodes. So JD, thank you very much for taking the time, and congratulations with this new APM product.
Really appreciate it, Alex. Thank you very much for having me on.
Great. We'll talk again soon.
Awesome. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.